Gough Whitlam walked to a microphone in Sydney on the evening of October 8, 1969, looked out at a packed hall of Australian Labor Party faithful, and said 19 words that should have ended careers, triggered Senate inquiries, and forced a decade-long reckoning with the government that had sent 521 Australian soldiers to their deaths in Southeast Asia. 19 words that landed in the political press the next morning like a grenade that nobody seemed willing to pick up. The sole purpose of Australia's participation in the Civil War in Vietnam was to keep United States military forces involved on the mainland of Asia. Wait. Stop. Read that again slowly. Not to stop communism, not to honor treaty obligations, not to defend Australian national security, not to support the South Vietnamese people against northern aggression. The sole purpose, the only purpose, the singular, undivided, entire reason 521 Australians would eventually die, and 60,000 Australians served, 521 were killed, and 3,129 had been wounded, was to keep American boots planted on Asian soil so that Australia could claim the benefit of American protection without paying the full price of American commitment. Oh, this story gets so much stranger than you think, because Whitlam said those words not as a retrospective judgment from the comfort of the history books, not as a post-war academic analysis from someone who had spent years in the archives. He said them as the leader of the opposition in the middle of a federal election campaign in a country that still had thousands of men deployed in Vietnam, in front of cameras that would carry his face into every lounge room in the country. He said them because he believed they were provably true. And decades later, when the cabinet records of the Menzies government, the Holt government, and every government that sustained the commitment were finally declassified and open to historians, those records did not contradict Whitlam. They confirmed him, almost word for word. Stay with me. To understand what Whitlam was actually saying in October 1969, and why the declassified records vindicate him so completely, you need to go back further than most people go when they think about Australia and Vietnam. Not to 1965, when the combat troops arrived, not to 1962, when the first 30 military advisors landed. You need to go back to 1942, February 15th, 1942, the fall of Singapore, because everything that followed, every cabinet minute, every diplomatic cable, every carefully worded public statement about the threat of communism in Southeast Asia, everything was downstream of that single catastrophic date. When Singapore fell to Japanese forces in 1942, 130,000 Allied troops were taken prisoner, including 15,000 Australians. The British had promised Singapore was impregnable. The British had deployed forces according to European doctrine in terrain where European doctrine was worthless. And in the process, Australia had been exposed as a nation whose ultimate security guarantee rested on a great power that turned out to have neither the capability nor the will to honor it in the moment of maximum danger. The men who led Australia through the early Cold War years, Robert Menzies, his Foreign Minister Richard Casey, the defense planners in Canberra, were not abstract strategists operating on theoretical models. They were men who had watched the Singapore guarantee dissolve in real time. They needed a replacement guarantee, and they needed it to be structurally binding in ways that British imperial protection had proven not to be. The United States, Australia, and New Zealand had signed the ANZUS Treaty in 1951. Menzies hoped that by Australia sending advisors to Vietnam, America would be more inclined to provide support should other Southeast Asian countries, such as Indonesia, threaten Australia more directly. Notice what that means when you read it carefully. The explicit hope behind military engagement in Vietnam was not the defense of Vietnam. It was the management of the American alliance. Vietnam was, from the beginning, a deposit made into the security account Australia held with Washington. The question was never whether South Vietnam needed saving. The question was whether American commitment to the Pacific region was robust enough to be depended upon when Australia needed it. And the answer, in the minds of Canberra's strategic planners, was that American commitment needed to be constantly reinforced, constantly incentivized, constantly purchased through demonstrated loyalty. The Australian government's main interest was in using Vietnam to lock America into the region. As Harold Holt put it, "We will win there and get protection in the South Pacific for a very small insurance premium." Read that again. An insurance premium. That is the phrase a sitting Australian Prime Minister used privately to describe the strategic logic behind sending conscripted 20-year-old men to a war in a country most of them could not have located on a map when they received their draft notices. Not a crusade against communism, not a moral obligation to a beleaguered ally. An insurance premium, a calculated payment made to a more powerful partner in exchange for future protection. The premium was paid in Australian blood. The policy was on American commitment to the region, and the men writing the premium checks were not the ones dying in the rubber plantations of Phuoc Tuy Province. The Menzies government signed the ANZUS Treaty, joined SEATO, and provided financial aid and support to South Vietnam. These were sequential steps in a strategic architecture designed not to combat communism as such, but to make Australia indispensable to American plans for the region. SEATO, the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, signed in 1954 after the French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, gave Canberra a formal multilateral framework to operate within. It also gave Menzies a public rationale that sounded considerably more principled than insurance premium management. The public story was about the dominoes. Vietnam became part of the government's scare campaign against the spread of communism. External Affairs Minister in the Menzies government, Percy Spender, told Parliament in 1950, "Should the forces of communism prevail and Vietnam come under the heel of communist China, Malaya is in danger of being outflanked." The private story was simpler, more transactional, and considerably less morally elevated. The Australian government's decisions to send a team of military advisors in 1962 and then ground forces in 1965 were motivated by strategic and economic interests. The U.S., Australia, and New Zealand had signed the ANZUS Treaty in 1951, and it was hoped that by showing a commitment to the American plan in Vietnam, Australia would secure more comprehensive protection against communism, as well as an improved trade relationship. The trade relationship was part of it. Menzies also hoped, in vain, that sending forces would improve trade between Australia and the U.S. So the calculation included economic benefits alongside strategic ones: troops to Vietnam in exchange for an improved trade relationship. The arithmetic of alliance management was always more complex than the rhetoric of democracy versus communism suggested. When Menzies flew to Washington, he was not carrying a principled case for Western intervention in a civil conflict. He was carrying a ledger, and he expected Washington to recognize the deposits being made. The Australian Army appointed one of its jungle warfare experts, Colonel Francis Ted Sarong, to establish an elite unit of jungle warfare and counterinsurgency experts. Known as the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam, its first 30 members were deployed to Vietnam in mid-1962. 30 advisors, low risk, deniable as combat involvement. They were dispersed around the country, and though they were supposed to be non-combatant advisors, they quickly found themselves having to lead by example in combat situations. The gap between public statement and operational reality opened very early in Australia's Vietnam commitment, and it never fully closed. The official position was non-combat advisory work. The operational reality was that Australian warrant officers were leading Vietnamese strike companies into firefights within months of arrival. The extent of the AATTV's combat involvement had been kept from the Australian public, so the deployment of a battalion meant that Australia was effectively at war. This pattern of official language that did not match operational reality, of stated purposes that did not match strategic intent, was not a bureaucratic accident. It was deliberate and sustained. The Menzies government understood that the Australian public would support involvement in Vietnam if the threat was presented as direct and existential. The Department of Defense advised against committing troops on the basis that neither North Vietnam nor China posed a real threat to Australia. Menzies ignored this advice. Read that sentence very slowly. His own Department of Defense told Robert Menzies in writing that the two threats he was publicly citing as justification for military commitment were not real threats to Australia. He ignored that advice and sent the troops anyway, because the troops were never really about defending Australia from Vietnamese or Chinese communism. They were about purchasing American commitment to Australia's defense. The defense advisors were answering the wrong question because they were not being told the right question. The escalation to full combat involvement in April 1965 was the decisive moment, and the circumstances surrounding it are perhaps the most revealing element in the entire record. On April 29, 1965, Prime Minister Robert Menzies announced in Parliament that Australia would send a battalion of combat troops to Vietnam. He framed the announcement as a response to a formal request from the South Vietnamese government, presenting it as Australia honoring an obligation to an ally who had asked for help. The problem was that this was not quite how the sequence of events had unfolded. What Menzies did not say was that his government had approached the United States requesting such an invitation. There had been no prior invitation from the South Vietnamese government. In fact, the South Vietnamese Prime Minister Phan Huy Quat had been reluctant to issue any formal request. While Menzies knew the United States would be receptive to him sending a battalion, he had to get permission from the South Vietnamese government. However, the South Vietnamese Prime Minister Phan Huy Quat was reluctant. He felt that the arrival of more foreign troops would be a propaganda coup for North Vietnam. So let's reconstruct what actually happened. Australia wanted to send troops. America had not specifically asked Australia to send combat troops. They had suggested increasing the number of advisors. Australia not only volunteered a full combat battalion proactively on April 28, 1965, Menzies went ahead with an announcement that an Australian battalion of 800 soldiers would be dispatched to Vietnam. In a hurried push, they were eventually able to secure a formal letter of request from Vietnam, dated 29 April 1965. The letter arrived on the same day as the announcement. The announcement came before the letter. The request that Menzies would tell Parliament he was responding to had to be almost forced out of a South Vietnamese government that didn't particularly want to issue it. and Australia's own Defence Department had advised the commitment wasn't strategically necessary. The gap between the public story and the documented reality was wide enough to drive a battalion through. The Australian newspaper commented in a front-page editorial, "Australia's contingent can have only insignificant military value. It will be purely a political pawn." They were right, and they knew it on day one. The decision was motivated by a desire to strengthen strategic relations with the United States and to halt the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. That's the historian's diplomatic summary. The strategic reality underneath it was Harold Holt's insurance premium. Australia was not responding to a threat. Australia was making a payment. The public story about communist aggression and the domino theory was the packaging. The actual product being purchased was American commitment to Pacific security. To persuade Washington to remain committed to the region, Australia had volunteered a battalion of combat troops in 1965, when the Americans had only been suggesting an increase in the number of advisors. When Robert Menzies retired in January 1966 and Harold Holt took over as Prime Minister, the strategic logic did not change, but the performance of it did. When Menzies retired, his successor, Harold Holt, in his very first prime ministerial statement, announced a further expansion of Australia's troop commitment, declaring that national service conscripts would be liable for combat duties in Vietnam. His very first statement as Prime Minister. Not a word about economic policy, social programs, or domestic concerns. The alliance relationship was the first item on the agenda. And then in June 1966, on a visit to Washington, Holt produced the single most famous five-word phrase in the history of the Australian-American alliance. In June 1966, Harold Holt visited President Lyndon B. Johnson at the White House. At a press conference, Holt declared that Australia was a staunch friend that will be all the way with LBJ, all the way with LBJ. The phrase became both a rallying cry and a punchline, sometimes simultaneously. Harold Holt's impulsive exclamation on the White House lawn in June 1966 that Australia was all the way with LBJ was also designed to strengthen American will. There it is again. Not to win in Vietnam, not to liberate South Vietnam from communist aggression, to strengthen American will. The whole public performance of the alliance, the declarations of loyalty, the troop increases, the rhetoric about shared values and democratic solidarity, was calculated strategic theater designed to prevent the Americans from reconsidering their Pacific commitment. If Washington ever concluded that Southeast Asia wasn't worth the cost, Australia needed Washington to feel that pulling back would mean abandoning an ally who had literally pledged to go all the way. He subsequently committed a further 1,700 Defense Force personnel to Vietnam. The Australian commitment grew because every increment of commitment was another deposit in the account, another claim on American loyalty, another argument against American withdrawal from the Pacific. The logic was circular and self-reinforcing, and it had nothing to do with whether Australian troops were achieving anything militarily valuable in Phuoc Toi province. Meanwhile, back in Australia, young men were being conscripted through one of the most bizarre lottery systems in democratic history. The National Service Act 1964, passed on November 24th, required 20-year-old males, if selected, to serve in the Army for a period of 24 months of continuous service, followed by 3 years in the Reserve. And the selection was not based on any assessment of military aptitude, physical fitness, or national need. It was based on a birthday ballot. Government officials reached into a barrel and pulled out numbered marbles, each marble corresponding to a birthday date. If your birthday came up, you went. If it didn't, you didn't. Young men whose birthdays fell on unlucky dates were sent to fight a war their government had entered for strategic insurance reasons, while their friends and brothers and classmates, born on slightly different days, stayed home. Over 63,000 men were conscripted, and over 19,000 served in Vietnam. Between 1965 and 1972, 15,300 national servicemen were conscripted into the Australian Army, with 200 of them killed in action and 1,200 wounded in Vietnam. The gap between the stated justification for the war and the operational reality of how it was being fought and sustained grew larger every year. A fortnight after Menzies' announcement, a Morgan Gallup poll found that 64% of people believed that communism would overrun Southeast Asia if left unchecked. The public believed the domino theory because they had been told the domino theory repeatedly and sincerely by their elected leaders. What they had not been told was that their own Department of Defense had assessed the direct military threat to Australia as essentially non-existent, that the South Vietnamese government had been pressured into a letter of request their Prime Minister didn't want to issue, and that the fundamental strategic rationale for the whole commitment was keeping American boots on Asian soil for Australian benefit. It was into this environment that Gough Whitlam stepped as the new Labour leader elected in February 1967. He was not, despite later mythology, an uncomplicated opponent of the war from the beginning. The month before the 1966 election, Whitlam visited Vietnam and toured the 1st Australian Task Force area in Phuoc Tuy Province. At that time, there was division within the ALP regarding its position on Vietnam and on the wisdom of Kelwell's insistence on campaigning in the 1966 election on the issue of Australia's involvement there. The Labour left wanted full-throated opposition. Whitlam understood the electoral politics well enough to know that Australians in 1966 still largely supported the commitment, and that the 1966 election, fought primarily on Vietnam and conscription, resulted in Holt winning what was then the biggest majority in Australia's electoral history. The public story was working. The gap between that story and the documentary record would take years to open wide enough for the electoral arithmetic to change. What changed the arithmetic was not a policy argument, it was casualties. It was the visible human cost of the birthday ballot falling on young men from working-class suburbs who came home in boxes while the strategic logic that had sent them there remained hidden in cabinet minutes. While support for the commitment to Vietnam remained relatively high, the issue of conscription became increasingly unpopular, especially once young conscripts became casualties. They were old enough to be sent overseas to fight, kill, and possibly die, but were too young to vote. The conscripts who died in Vietnam were not eligible to vote in the elections that produced the governments that sent them there. The moral obscenity of that detail was not lost on the Australian public, and as the casualties mounted, it became harder and harder to maintain public support for a war whose true strategic rationale had never been shared with the people being asked to die for it. The Tet Offensive of February 1968 was the event that cracked the public story beyond repair. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army attacked more than 100 cities and towns simultaneously, including the American Embassy compound in Saigon. February 1968 was a turning point in the Vietnam War with the Tet Offensive. the Viet Cong mounted a series of attacks on major centers throughout South Vietnam. Although the Viet Cong suffered enormous losses, it was a psychological and propaganda victory for them. For the Australian government, Tet was the moment when the public performance of confidence became structurally unsustainable. The governments of Menzies and Holt had promised that progress was being made, that the alliance was holding, that the strategic investment was paying dividends. Tet suggested very strongly that none of this was true. From the end of 1967 onwards, the atmosphere within the Australian government over the Vietnam War was totally different from when the year began. The focus of attention became how to bring Australian troops home as the Americans withdrew theirs. Holt's successors were caught between the escalating financial costs of the commitment and the political costs of an increasingly unpopular war. Harold Holt himself would not live to navigate the wreckage of the strategic narrative he had so enthusiastically constructed. President Johnson began an international trip with the primary purpose of attending the memorial services for Australian Prime Minister Harold Holt, who disappeared while swimming on December 17, 1967. The man who had gone all the way with LBJ disappeared into the waters off Cheviot Beach, and the alliance he had personified and the war he had escalated continued without him, gradually devouring its own rationale. It was in this political landscape that Whitlam delivered his 1969 election policy speech. By then, public attitudes to the Vietnam War had changed, and the conflict, as well as conscription, had become increasingly unpopular. Whitlam had been moving toward a clearer position for 2 years, watching the polls shift, watching the public story collapse under the weight of its own internal contradictions. When he stood up in October 1969 and said the sole purpose of Australia's Vietnam commitment was to keep American forces on the Asian mainland, he was not making a radical left-wing argument. He was making a factual argument, and he was making it with the confidence of a man who had read the classified briefings, understood the strategic architecture, and knew that the documents, when eventually released, would support every word. For 3 years, 1965, 1966, and 1967, the Liberals misled you, deceived you about the purpose and prospects of the war. That's from the same 1969 speech. Note the word choice, not mistaken, not misjudged, misled, deceived. The accusation was deliberate. And then the 19 words, the sole purpose of Australia's participation in the Civil War in Vietnam was to keep United States military forces involved on the mainland of Asia. And then, more devastating still, Whitlam's assessment of what the whole enterprise had actually achieved. The sole achievement of that war, the sole consequence of the devastation of an entire country, the destruction of a proud and civilized nation, the loss of over 300 Australian lives, the political destruction of one of the strongest presidents in America's history, the near disruption of the American political system, has been to hasten to make certain that American withdrawal from our region, which our participation was supposed to delay or prevent. Australian arms remain undimmed, but Australian policy has never suffered so total and unrelieved a defeat. That passage requires a moment to sit with, not because it is poetic, but because it is analytically precise. Whitlam was not mourning the war emotionally. He was auditing the strategic investment. You paid the premium, he was telling Australia. You put in the blood, the money, the conscripts, the international political capital. And what did you get for it? The very outcome you were trying to prevent. American withdrawal from the region, The insurance policy had not paid out. The premium had been collected, and the coverage had been canceled by the insurer anyway, because the insurer had decided the risk was too great regardless of what Australia paid. The logic that had sustained the commitment from 1962 to 1969, pay now for protection later, had been invalidated by events, and the men who had designed that logic and sustained it through two governments had never told the Australian public that this was the logic at work. By the time Whitlam was making this argument in October 1969, the disintegration of the public commitment was already visible in the streets of Australian cities. About a fortnight after Gorton's announcement that the 8th Battalion would not be replaced, 120,000 people took part in the nation's first Vietnam Moratorium March to protest against the war and conscription. The moratoriums were historic mobilizations. They were also, in a sense, proof that the public had finally sensed what the cabinet records would eventually confirm, that the stated reasons for the war and the actual reasons for the war were different things, and that the people who had been asked to die for the stated reasons had been deceived about the actual ones. John Gorton had succeeded Holt as Prime Minister in early 1968, and by 1970 he had begun what would become a phased withdrawal. The process of withdrawal had effectively begun in 1970, when Prime Minister Gorton announced that the 8th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment would not be replaced at the end of its tour of duty, and his successor, William McMahon, subsequently announced additional troop withdrawals. The withdrawal was driven not by strategic reassessment in Canberra, but by strategic reassessment in Washington. Government plans were driven less by growing protests than by the U.S., which was embarking on its own drawdown without consulting its allies, including Australia. In June 1969, U.S. President Richard Nixon announced the withdrawal of 25,000 American troops, and in September announced the withdrawal of a further 35,000. Notice the confirmation buried in that sentence. The United States embarked on its own drawdown without consulting its allies, including Australia. The alliance that had consumed 521 Australian lives and more than 10 years of strategic commitment was being unwound by Washington without even a courtesy consultation with Canberra. The insurance policy, whose premium had been paid in blood, was not just failing to pay out. It wasn't even being communicated to the policyholder before the terms changed. It was important for Australia not to be too far ahead or behind U.S. policy announcements, so the Prime Minister was given discretion as to the timing of Australia's own announcement. Australia's Vietnam withdrawal was timed to American announcements. The entry had been designed around keeping America in. The exit was designed around following America out. The strategic dependency that had defined the commitment from the beginning defined its conclusion as well. William McMahon, who replaced Gorton as Prime Minister in March 1971, understood the political mathematics clearly enough. On August 18, 1971, the 5th anniversary of the Battle of Long Tan, Prime Minister Billy McMahon announced the 2 remaining battalions would be home by Christmas. The Long Tan anniversary date was not accidental. It was a piece of political theater designed to frame withdrawal as a dignified strategic choice rather than a tail-following exercise. Nixon's decision to visit Beijing was an embarrassment for Prime Minister McMahon. McMahon had only that month denounced opposition leader Gough Whitlam for making such a visit, calling him a spokesman for the enemy in Vietnam. Nixon went to Beijing within weeks of McMahon calling Whitlam a traitor for having gone there. The strategic credibility of the McMahon government's Vietnam position was consuming itself from the inside. By the time the 1972 federal election arrived, in August 1971, the Liberals announced that the bulk of Australian troops would be withdrawn by Christmas. By the time Whitlam was elected in December 1972, only a handful of Australian advisers and a platoon of troops guarding the Australian embassy in Saigon remained. The war that Whitlam was elected to end had, for most practical purposes, already been ended by the governments he was running against. This is the irony that complicates the clean narrative of Whitlam as the man who stopped the war. He was, technically, the man who signed the final paperwork on a withdrawal that had been underway for 2 years. Most Australian troops were withdrawn from the Republic of Vietnam after the Tet Offensive in 1968, a decision made by former Liberal Prime Minister John Gorton's government. The final Australian combat role ended in 1971 under former Liberal Prime Minister William McMahon's government. But the paperwork mattered, and the speed with which Whitlam moved mattered. On its 7th day in power, the Whitlam government announced the withdrawal of Australia's remaining troops, which were designated as military advisers. 7 days. Not a review committee, not a strategic assessment, not a consultation with Washington. 7 days in power, and the remaining Australian presence in Vietnam was over. The government officially ended Australia's involvement in the war on January 11, 1973, when Governor-General Paul Hasluck issued an official proclamation formally ending hostilities. The same Paul Hasluck who, as Foreign Minister under Menzies, had been described as the intellectual architect of Australian intervention in Vietnam was now, as Governor-General, signing the proclamation that formally ended it. History's sense of irony occasionally shows genuine craft. The Duumvirate made 40 significant decisions in its brief tenure, including the immediate release of all draft resistors, the removal of troops from Vietnam, and the recognition of Communist China. The recognition of Communist China was itself a repudiation of the strategic architecture that had underpinned the Vietnam commitment. If Communist China was now a diplomatic partner rather than the existential threat anchoring the domino theory, the entire rationale for everything that had preceded the last decade of Australian foreign policy collapsed into incoherence. Whitlam understood this. He moved on all fronts simultaneously because he understood that Vietnam, conscription, and China recognition were not 3 separate issues. They were different expressions of the same rotten premise. After winning office in December 1972, Whitlam established diplomatic relations with the Democratic Republic of Vietnam in February 1973. Not just ended the war, established relations with the North Vietnamese government, whose existence his predecessors had spent 11 years and 521 lives trying to contain. Now, let's do what Whitlam's accusation demands. Let's look at the cabinet records, and let's ask whether they prove what he claimed. The records confirm, with remarkable consistency across 3 separate governments, a pattern of private strategic reasoning that was systematically hidden from public view. They confirm that the commitment was driven by alliance management concerns rather than direct security threats. Australia's national objective should be to strengthen the Western commitment generally to the defense of mainland Southeast Asia. To effectively secure the region, there needed to be a Western presence on the Asian mainland. With the Americans stationed in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines, and engaged in Vietnam, the committee believed that an active and substantial United States role in implementing this concept is vital to Australia. Not that Australia needed to fight in Vietnam, that America needed to be engaged in Asia, and Australia's task was to ensure that engagement remained robust. The records confirm that Australia pushed for combat involvement more enthusiastically than America asked for it. Australia's participation was not a result of pressure from America. Australia had its own interests for encouraging and participating in the war. The records confirm that the South Vietnamese request that Menzies cited in Parliament was manufactured, not received. The records confirm that defense advised against the commitment on the grounds that no genuine threat to Australia existed, and that advice was overruled for political reasons. The records confirm that troop levels were calibrated not to military requirements in Vietnam, but to political calculations about how much visible commitment Washington needed to see from Canberra. The records confirm that withdrawal was timed to American withdrawal, not to any Australian strategic assessment, and the records confirm that throughout the entire 11-year commitment, the primary question in Australian cabinet was not, "Are we helping Vietnam?" but, "Are we keeping America in the Pacific?" Every one of those confirmations is a brick in the wall Whitlam built with 19 words in 1969. But there is a dimension to this story that the strategic analysis risks obscuring. Behind every cabinet minute, every diplomatic cable, every insurance premium calculation were real men in real jungles. The 11-year conflict had been the longest in Australian military history. 60,000 Australians had served during the Vietnam War. 521 were killed, and 3,129 had been wounded. Those men were not wrong to fight. They were not wrong to serve. They answered the call their government issued. They went to a war their leaders said was necessary. They fought with extraordinary courage and considerable tactical skill in conditions that would have broken less disciplined soldiers. The SAS patrols that moved like ghosts through Poak Tui province, the infantrymen who held their lines at Long Tan against 20-1 odds, the training team warrant officers who led Montagnard strike companies in the Central Highlands and earned 4 Victoria Crosses between them. These were not instruments of deception. They were men doing their duty as they understood it. The deception was not visited upon the enemy. It was visited upon the soldiers themselves and upon the public that sent them. The men who died in Vietnam did not die for the reason they were told they were dying. They died for an insurance premium. They died so that cabinet planners in air-conditioned offices in Canberra could feel confident that the Pacific Guarantee was being maintained. They died so that Harold Holt could tell Lyndon Johnson that Australia was all the way with him, and mean it in a way that locked Johnson's successors into ongoing regional commitment. They died for a theory about American behavior in the Pacific that turned out to be wrong, that sufficient Australian commitment could prevent American withdrawal. Nixon pulled back anyway. The premium was insufficient to cover the risk, and the men who had paid it with their lives had never been told what they were actually paying for. The Whitlam government supported the shift from the strategic doctrine of forward defense to the doctrine of continental defense. Forward defense was a product of the Cold War security environment in which Australian forces were based within Asia, so that they could be easily deployed to conflicts in Indochina. The aim of this doctrine was to repel threats before they reached Australian soil. The shift to continental defense was an acknowledgement that the forward defense strategy had failed at its primary task and that the replacement strategy needed to be more honestly grounded in what Australia could actually defend, rather than what America might be persuaded to protect. It was a more honest doctrine precisely because it abandoned the fiction that Australian security could be purchased through strategic performance in other people's wars. What makes Whitlam's 19 words so enduring is not their rhetorical force, though they have that. It is their analytical accuracy. He made a precise factual claim, in public, about the hidden motivation of a decade of government policy, and he made it before the documents were available to confirm it. He made it based on his reading of how the alliance worked, how cabinet decisions were actually made, and what the real calculus of forward defense had always been. And then the documents came out. And the documents said the same thing Whitlam said. The sole purpose was to keep America there. It is in the context of Australia's true needs, true role in the region, and true relations with the great ally, the United States, that proposals to disengage from Vietnam must be seen. True needs, true role, true relations. Whitlam used the word true 3 times in that sentence because he understood that the previous 8 years had been built on untrue versions of all 3. The untrue need, that Australia faced a direct communist military threat from Vietnam or China. The untrue role, that Australia was an active, principled defender of South Vietnamese sovereignty. The untrue relation, that the alliance was a partnership of equals operating on shared values, rather than a transaction in which Australia paid insurance premiums and hoped the policy paid out. The verdict of the cabinet records is not complicated. It is not ambiguous. It does not require interpretive subtlety to extract. Australia committed to Vietnam to keep America in the Pacific. Australia escalated in Vietnam to prevent American strategic retreat from Asia. Australia sustained the commitment through conscription and casualties, not because the military situation demanded it, but because the alliance mathematics required visible ongoing commitment. And Australia withdrew when America withdrew, timing the exit to American policy announcements rather than to any independent strategic calculation. Every one of these conclusions is supported by the declassified record. Every one of them validates what Whitlam said in 19 words in October 1969. The longest war in Australian military history. 5 prime ministers, 11 years, 3 governments, 60,000 Australians served. 521 were killed. 3,129 had been wounded. The cabinet records, when opened, told a story that the men who made those decisions had never told the Australian public. They told a story about insurance premiums and alliance management and strategic architecture. They told a story about a nation that had learned from Singapore that dependence on great powers was dangerous, and had responded to that lesson by making itself even more dependent on an even greater power, paying the price of that dependence in the most irreversible currency available. Gough Whitlam called it exactly right, not after the fact, not from the archives, but in 1969, in the middle of an election campaign, in front of cameras and reporters and political opponents who had every incentive to prove him wrong. He called it, with 19 words, that the cabinet records would spend the next several decades confirming, one declassified document at a time. The sole purpose was to keep America there. The records prove he was right, and 521 Australians paid the premium on a policy that didn't cover what they were told it covered. That is the story the cabinet records tell. That is the story Whitlam told first.